Hello, I'm ELD, and this is You Can Play Legacy, a series where we talk about legacy decks on a modern budget. This deck is actually cheaper than most modern decks, even cheaper than modern Burn, and it is a ton of fun to play. Burn has gotten so many people into Legacy, and we're going to break down this incredibly aggressive deck. Here's a deck list from Germany. There you go. Feel free to pause that if you want a longer look, but we got to get going on this one because there's a lot to unpack. This very aggressive deck. We've got a ton of burn. We're talking about Lightning Bolt, Chain Lightning, Lava Spike, Rift Bolt. Are you noticing a pattern here? 3 damage for 1 mana is where you want to be with this deck. All you really need is 7 of those total. Throw them at your opponent's face, and that is a wrap. Now, Rift Bolt does have a 3 casting cost in the upper right-hand corner, but we're suspending it for 1. It's actually kind of useful given that you can get multiple spells played in the same turn with suspend, or you can potentially get around something like Chalice of the Void because it doesn't actually cost 1 mana. You pay 1, but the actual cost is 3. So, Exquisite Firecraft. Now we're talking about finishers. This is one of the best. It's a great reason to play Burn. There was a list that won a GP a while back running 4 of these and a little bit extra mana, and it was a great metagame call at the time. This deck certainly can be tweaked for your metagame, and this is one of those cards that you can add more of if you're facing a ton of counter magic, not as much life gain. 3 casting costs to do 4 damage, and it's going to be uncounterable when you have 2 instants or sorceries in your graveyard, which is pretty much always, as that's what this deck is doing, is throwing burn at your opponent's face. Price of Progress is a hell of a finisher. Now, if you don't think Price of Progress is going to be good in your metagame, this may not be the deck for you. This deck is very, very strong because of Price of Progress. Without it, I actually would rather play one of the other decks that we're talking about in this series. But man, when it is strong, I'm talking about doing at least 4, possibly 6, 8, or more damage for only 2 mana. Whew, it is brutal. I've seen lands absolutely decimated by this deck. A deck that is incredibly good running Tabernacle, all the revised dual lands in it. It was so expensive and just utterly destroyed by Price of Progress, sometimes at the hand of a child. I mean, literally just like completely blown out. Nothing they could do. This Price of Progress hits and does like 14 damage, and they're at like 10 at the time. Fire Blast is the ultimate finisher in the deck. Really makes you feel like you're playing Eternal Magic with free spells. They've never really gotten free spells, to be fair, because they're not. It's free. You're getting 4 damage by sacking 2 mountains here. That's 6 casting costs in the upper right-hand corner. Never going to be relevant outside, of course, the fact that you're not going to see Chalice of the Void stopping it. But man, 4 damage for 2 mountains. This is going to be kind of the last play of the game. Generally, you're not going to use this until you're done using your mountains. Obviously, you don't want to land screw yourself. Now, the most important part of playing this deck is sequencing your creatures first. That is probably the biggest thing that new players have to learn, is you got to get those creatures out first, get that damage in there, and follow it up with the burn. Goblin Guide here, the most efficient of the bunch. At 1 red, he's a 2/2 with haste. Incredible. The drawback sometimes hurts you, which is your opponent gets to get a land into their hand, but you also get to see the top card of their library, which can be useful. But honestly, this is all about just pushing through as much damage as possible. Monastery Swiftspear, a little less efficient up front or less powerful, but certainly gets better with an investment. Once you've played a spell, it's just as good as Goblin Guide. Once you play multiple spells, it got actually significantly better, and some of your strongest draws involve multiple Swiftspears. And this card really piles on the damage. Also, that backside getting bigger can make it difficult to block as well. At least block it profitably. Eidolon of the Great Revels, incredibly crucial card for this deck. This gives you game versus the more broken decks in the format. Things like Storm that are going to look to play tons and tons of spells. Things like 8 casts, which are just going to be playing bauble after bauble, trying to keep up with you. Here, Eidolon is going to punish them, doing 2 damage every time. Now, you're also going to be taking damage when you play those cheap spells that are in your deck, but generally it's worth it as you're going to be pushing through more damage for them, and this is just a race to get them to 0 as quickly as possible. Now, there's a bunch of flex spots in Burn. This particular list that we pulled up runs a couple copies of Pyrostatic Pillar, which is essentially extra Eidolons in enchantment form, and Roiling Vortex, a enchantment that gives some inevitability, pushing through damage each turn. Also stops free spells to a degree, doing 5 damage, so your opponent's generally not going to want to be playing any of those 0 casting costs or free cards, and very nicely can stop your opponent from gaining life as well, which can be a very relevant thing in a room that has Uro in it. The mana base is entirely mountains. This build does run a couple Barbarian Rings. Now, I actually don't love this card in this deck. I want to like Barbarian Ring. I've tried it so many times. I have actually played a bunch of Burn, often have it built for new players to borrow. Generally, not impressed with Barbarian Ring. Sometimes 1 copy's fine. This runs 2. If you're going to play this, I'd love to hear in the comments how Barbarian Ring works for you. In my experience, there's just as many games where Fire Blast gets denied the mountains that it needs, or the damage from this kind of accumulates to actually matter compared to the 2 damage from Barbarian Ring actually mattering. You could also potentially run a cantrip in there, something like Fiery Islet to draw a card. That's also a consideration. A notable omission from this list is Skewer the Critics. Any of those flex slots, the Roiling Vortex and the Sulfuric Vortex, could easily be Skewer the Critics, as could Exquisite Firecraft. This is just an additional burn spell. Very, very efficient, but as it turns out, there's actually not that much room in the list. There's only so much space to go around, but this is a worthy card for sure. Again, gets around Chalice of the Void. Into the sideboard, we're starting out with Leyline of the Void. This deck is racing your opponent, and it is not equipped to outrace something like Reanimator or decks that can win on the first turn. Burn will never win with Burn on the first turn. Your opponent might accidentally kill themselves, but it's not going to have anything to do with you. So I guess they could ad nauseum into your open mountain, but for the most part, it's not going to happen. You're going to need some support. Leyline of the Void is the most powerful of those. In the hands that you're mulling to Leyline, remember, lean on those creatures. A hand, like if you mull to 5 and you have like land, Goblin Guide, Leyline of the Void, that could be totally fine. Like you'll actually push through some damage. Hopefully you top deck some more burn, shorten that window, and win before your opponent can actually get rid of that Leyline. Searing Blood is an excellent sideboard option versus creatures, as is Smash to Smithereens for artifacts. Both cards very similar, destroying something and doing 3 damage to their controller. Really useful for keeping the pressure on. It kind of hurts to take time off to kill their creature. Doing things like lightning bolting their creatures often feels very bad because you're not actually pushing through the damage to their face. You do need to do that sometimes to get in there with your creatures. It ends up being a net positive, but even better if you can kill their creature and do damage. And of course, killing a Batterskull with this is absolutely where you want to be. Sulfuric Vortex, very strong card, especially versus all the life gain out there. 2 damage to each player gives that inevitability each upkeep, where if you can get your opponent low enough, this will eventually win the game, and not being able to gain life removes any hope of getting out of there. And just as a couple of other options here, we've got Alpine Moon. If you're playing against Dark Depths, you're probably going to want this, as that actually stops them from winning with their Dark Depths unless they have an answer to Alpine Moon, because that is just a very difficult matchup for Burn. That 2020 can come out of nowhere and wrap the game up and undo all of that hard work that you've been doing by throwing Burn at their face. So that is Burn. I hope you guys enjoyed this. We love likes and subscribes. Let us know how you enjoy these videos, what you'd like to see in them, and we'll keep doing this, spreading the love of Legacy. We appreciate your help with that. Peace.